Prelude, Hermann Göring. Long before World War II broke out and Europe plunged into terror and destruction, Hermann Göring had already secured a privileged position in the Nazi leadership, right in the shadow of Adolf Hitler. He was not merely a politician, he was something far more dangerous. A ruthless opportunist, armed with near absolute power. Decorated as a hero in World War I, charismatic in his speeches and a media figure of the regime, Göring embodied the visible face of the Third Reich from the very beginning. He was the first commander of the SA, founded the dreaded Gestapo, and ruled Prussia with an iron fist. From his desk came orders that inaugurated the first concentration camps, while in his mansion, stolen works of art, exotic luxuries, and symbols of a grandeur he believed eternal began to pile up. He did not act out of fanaticism, but out of calculation. He knew how to adapt, climb the ranks, gather titles and privileges, until he became the second most powerful man in the Nazi regime. But his ambition ultimately sealed his fate. As Hitler began to fall, Göring tried to take over, and for that, he was accused of treason by his own comrades. This documentary reconstructs the meteoric rise and dramatic fall of the German aviator who believed himself invincible. Göring enters the scene, from war hero to Reich figure. In the autumn of 1922, Göring attended a political rally in Munich as a spectator. There, he heard Adolf Hitler speak for the first time. It wasn't just any speech. Hitler's words about the Treaty of Versailles and the need for a forceful response resonated deeply with Göring's own beliefs. That encounter was decisive. After the speech, he approached the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and offered his full collaboration, convinced that they shared the same goal: to dismantle what had been imposed by the victorious powers. At that time, Hitler had already formed the Sturmabteilung, better known as the SA, a paramilitary force created to both protect his rallies and disrupt those of his opponents. Before long, Göring was invited to join the party and was tasked with reorganizing this militia. His prestige as a former commander of the Richthofen squadron gave Hitler a strategic advantage, while for Göring, it meant transitioning from civilian life to the core of a movement that promised to change Germany's destiny. Although he initially kept a low profile, he immediately began to exert influence within the party. He focused on transforming the SA into a disciplined and loyal structure. He recruited among young workers willing to sacrifice their time and energy. Within a matter of months, that once chaotic force numbered 11,000 members and responded faithfully to both Göring and Hitler. During this period, Göring strengthened ties with key figures in the National Socialist circle, such as Rudolf Hess, Ernst Röhm, and Alfred Rosenberg. His home in Obermenzing, which he shared with his wife Karin, became a regular meeting place for the party. There, strategies were discussed, alliances were forged, and action plans were outlined. Karin, deeply convinced of Hitler's leadership, accompanied her husband even to the movement's public events. In 1923, the economic crisis, rampant inflation, and political disintegration of the Weimar Republic pushed the party to accelerate its maneuvers. Göring actively collaborated in Hitler's efforts to gain the support of sectors within the Bavarian army. In November, with Karin still recovering from illness, he received the order to mobilize the SA for what would become the attempted coup at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall. There, alongside Hitler and Hess, he took the stage as the party leader demanded armed support to overthrow the government. The attempted coup had begun. After storming the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall, Hitler took the stage. In front of hundreds of attendees and alongside his closest collaborators, he announced that the national revolution was underway. Outside, armed men already controlled the building. No one was allowed to leave. Göring, dressed in a leather coat with his war decoration hanging from his neck, assumed a key role, securing the operation, maintaining control of the hall and calming tensions. From the podium, he tried to reassure the crowd with a cynical remark. There was no reason to complain. The beer was still flowing. That night, convinced the coup could succeed, Göring left instructions for his wife, Karin. He asked an aide to call her and handed over a letter that was to be sent by mail. Then, As the group advanced toward the center of Munich, he took precautions. He ordered that hostages be brought along, including several local officials, hoping their presence would provide an advantage in the event of a confrontation. During the march, he attempted to negotiate with the police. He walked at the front of the group, greeted the commanding officer, and warned that if they were attacked, the hostages would be in danger. But gunfire soon erupted. Amid the chaos, he was shot in the groin. Severely wounded, he was pulled off the street and taken to a nearby house, where Karin and her sister cared for him until nightfall. Later, he was secretly moved to a private clinic. In a letter to her mother, Karin described the severity of the wound: infections, constant fever, and a leg connected to tubes to drain pus. Despite promising the police he would not flee, he was smuggled out of the country in a car and crossed the border with false documentation. The former war hero was now entering a dark chapter. Exiled in Sweden, Göring fell into a deep dependence on morphine, leading to serious physical and mental deterioration. His in-laws were shocked by his appearance. Eventually, he was diagnosed as a dangerous addict. On September 1st, 1925, he was admitted to the Langbro sanatorium, where a Swedish doctor described him as unstable, impulsive, and emotionally unpredictable. Badly wounded and in exile, he went through a long period of recovery in Sweden. But as soon as he was able, he returned to Germany. He traveled alone, as Karin remained behind, ill and in need of treatment. Back in Munich, he sought to rebuild his relationship with Hitler, who was now attempting to reorganize the party with a new strategy, gaining power through legal means. However, the circumstances had changed. His former position as head of the SA had been assigned to another man, and at that time, Hitler was not willing to replace him with an officer who lacked resources. He therefore advised Göring to return to Berlin, seek economic stability, and remain close to the movement. During the winter, he managed to establish himself as a middleman in the aviation industry. However, his political ambition remained alive. In 1928, determined to regain prominence, he pressured Hitler for a more visible role. Eventually, he was accepted as a National Socialist candidate for the Reichstag. His election as a deputy, alongside Joseph Goebbels, marked his formal return to the political stage. Unlike his colleague, Göring showed genuine enthusiasm for the position, convinced of his role as a representative of the people. Now settled in Berlin, he adopted an active social profile. His home welcomed figures from high society, industrialists and political allies. Karin, though weakened, described the atmosphere with a mix of awe and exhaustion. Some nicknamed him the Salon Nazi, while others saw him as the link between Hitler and the elites. In Parliament, he began to stand out. His speeches defended strategic interests, such as the development of German aviation, and he attacked the effects of the Dawes Plan on the national economy. Meanwhile, the party was growing. The 1930 elections gave the NSDAP a significant advance. The message was clear: they were fighting the existing system, but from within. Throughout his rise, Karin accompanied him whenever her health allowed. However, the constant rhythm of travel and public events gradually wore her down. During one of those trips, she lost consciousness. Upon waking, she could barely utter a single phrase, filled with resignation. In the shadow of power, the Gestapo and total control. Amid the growing prominence of the party, Göring was consolidating his presence as a key figure in Berlin. Re-elected as president of the Reichstag in December 1932, he used his position not to strengthen the institution, but to publicly discredit it. He bluntly warned that its existence would be brief, anticipating the changes that were already being orchestrated behind the scenes. While Hitler faced internal divisions, Göring acted as a negotiator on his behalf. In the weeks leading up to the seizure of power, he maintained constant contact with key political players, from von Papen to high-ranking state officials. Cross-threats marked the internal tension. Hitler even hinted at suicide if he lost control of the party, and Göring, more direct, promised to crush those who sided with Otto Strasser. During January 1933, the leaders of the NSDAP gathered in Lippe to capitalize on a symbolic regional election. Göring arrived at dawn, joining the propaganda team led by Goebbels. Meanwhile, high-level contacts continued. On the 22nd, a private meeting took place between Hitler, Göring and Frick with emissaries of President Hindenburg. The meeting, held at von Ribbentrop's house, was a turning point. The next day, Göring returned from Dresden, where he had publicly rejected the idea of joining the existing cabinet. Immediately, together with Hitler, he proposed a government formula, Frick as Reich Minister of the Interior and himself as Interior Minister of Prussia. Days later, he burst into a private meeting to announce the final decision. Hitler would be appointed Chancellor. For months, he had operated as a constant intermediary between the party and power. On the morning of January 30th, he was the first to go out to meet the crowd proclaiming the news. For him, that moment was not only a political victory, he described it as the fulfillment of a higher will. Hours after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, Göring organized a reception at his official residence. The foreign press was summoned on the afternoon of January 30th in an atmosphere marked by the euphoria of the new regime. While victory chants echoed through the streets, Göring smiled at journalists in the palace's halls, trying to ease the tension with courteous gestures. However, the change in atmosphere was already evident, even to those who did not share the enthusiasm for the new power. That same day, from the Reich's microphone, Göring addressed the nation. He proclaimed the beginning of a new era, praising Marshal Hindenburg and exalting Hitler as the nation's guide. He promised bread, work, and greatness for the German people, assuring that the suffering of the past 14 years was behind them. But behind the public speech, the priorities were clear. As he would declare years later at Nuremberg, the seizure of power would not be jeopardized by parliamentary processes or unstable majorities. It had to be secured by any means necessary. For Göring, success justified any measure. If the revolution triumphed, he said, then it was no longer illegal. It became the new legality. As Interior Minister of Prussia, he adopted an inflexible tone. On February 17th, he ordered the police to act without hesitation against any form of resistance, assuring that those who fired in the line of duty would have his full support. In Dortmund, he went further. He stated that every bullet fired by the police was essentially his own. Whoever did not obey or hesitated would be removed. In this context, he created the Gestapo on his own initiative. According to him, it was the indispensable tool to eliminate the communist threat. He directed it alongside Rudolf Diels and openly justified both the brutality and the establishment of the first concentration camps, where thousands of opponents were imprisoned. The initial excesses, he admitted, were inevitable, but necessary, according to his logic of national restoration. From his proclamation as Chancellor, Hitler found in Göring a decisive operator to consolidate the new order. While traditional institutions were still trying to adapt, Göring acted swiftly. The Reichstag fire, which occurred on February 27, 1933, immediately became a political tool. Although he denied having planned the event and even called it absurd to suggest that he needed such an incident to justify repressive measures, the fact is that the emergency was used without delay. Years later, Göring joked that some saw him as if he had watched the Reichstag fire with pleasure, like Nero did when Rome burned. Beyond the accusations, he maintained that the attack did not fit his initial plans, but forced him to adjust his strategy. According to his own words, he took on the role of a commander who must modify his offensive in response to an unexpected move by the opponent. Measures against the communists began immediately. He ordered mass arrests, pushed for trials, and proposed the immediate execution of the main suspect, Marinus van der Lubbe, although he decided to hold him with the expectation of obtaining more names. For him, there was no doubt, the guilty had to be found and punished without legal restrictions. He openly declared that he would not be stopped by judicial considerations. His goal was to eliminate, not to deliberate. The Reichsmarschall justified the creation of detention camps as a preventive measure. He stated that he did not know how long the internments would last or how many would be necessary, but considered it inevitable to isolate the enemies of the state. He admitted that there were abuses in the first months, despite having ordered that they be avoided, although he downplayed them as collateral effects. As head of the political police and the secret police, his power expanded rapidly. However, at Hitler's insistence, he agreed to transfer police authority to Heinrich Himmler. It was a strategic concession aimed at allowing a centralized structure to operate throughout the Reich. At the same time, Reinhard Heydrich was put in charge of the operational leadership of the Gestapo, consolidating his role within the Nazi repressive apparatus. While consolidating the repressive machinery of the new regime, Göring also transformed his personal life and public image. After several years as a widower, in 1932, he met the actress Emmy Sonnemann during a theatrical play in Weimar and was impressed. Shortly after, already as president of the Reichstag, he wrote her a brief, direct note from his new office: "Ich liebe dich." Although he began a new relationship, he never ceased to pay tribute to Karin, his first wife. He maintained contact with her family and preserved her memory as a central part of his identity. During that period, Göring consolidated his power from Berlin. He ordered the construction of an official residence next to the Gestapo headquarters, which had been established in the former Museum of Folklore. From there, Rudolf Diels carried out the operations of the secret police under the structure initially designed by Göring himself. But his political rise wasn't his only occupation. He also began projecting himself as a princely figure, amassing properties, art, and status symbols. In the Schorfheide region, he chose a vast forested area where he built Karin Hall, a mansion he named in honor of Karin. It was an estate reserved almost exclusively for his personal use. With a mix of imperial hunting lodge, private luxury, and art gallery, he turned the place into a reflection of his character: grandiose, theatrical, obsessed with image. He welcomed his guests there with carefully orchestrated displays. Sometimes he would arrive in sports cars, dressed in high boots with a hunting knife at his belt. During tours of the estate, he often highlighted the burial vault built for Karin, a mausoleum he considered his personal legacy. He proudly showed off the flowers and the inscription, "To my one and only Karin." For Göring, the cult of his deceased wife was inseparable from his self-image as a dominant figure in the new Reich. But while Göring cultivated his image as a statesman and patron, deep down he was still driven by chaotic impulses and volatile energy. He was capable of launching projects with enthusiasm, but avoided the details or disciplined follow-up. His boundless ambition coexisted with an improvised management of power. In this context, his fear of Ernst Röhm shaped key decisions. Röhm's influence within the SA, which already counted millions of members, was beginning to unsettle both the regular army and conservative sectors. Göring, aware of the risk, allied himself with Himmler, head of the SS, and entrusted the operational leadership of the political police to Rudolf Diels. Although Hitler tolerated Röhm's environment, even when serious accusations of abuse of power surfaced, tensions escalated quickly. On April 1st, Göring agreed to cede total control of the police to Himmler. From that moment on, the repressive apparatus was already in the hands of the SS. When Hitler finally decided to intervene, Göring acted without hesitation. While the leader was absent from Munich, he insisted on proceeding without delays or trials. During the days of the purge, he ordered executions without any legal process. At the headquarters where the detainees were gathered, he was heard shouting names and demanding, "Shoot him!" The operation reached figures with history in the movement, such as Gustav von Kahr, who was brutally murdered and thrown into a swamp. Others, like Schleicher and Strasser, were executed after appearing on the list that Hitler personally reviewed, while Göring and Himmler waited silently. The actual number of victims was never definitively established. The purge marked a new stage: terror as an instrument of government, with Göring as one of its main enforcers. The Führer's second in command, ambition, wealth, and absolute power. After the 1934 purge, Göring emerged as one of the most powerful figures of the regime. In these early years of absolute dominance, his character was fully shaped. He definitively abandoned the profile of the impoverished agitator and opportunistic businessman to become a man surrounded by assistants, with unlimited access to wealth, privileges, and power. But this transformation also made him more vulnerable. Now he had too much to lose. From then on, he completely subordinated his will to Hitler's. He became his most efficient executor, his most visible spokesperson, and his unofficial representative to foreign governments. "If the Führer says it, then 2 and 2 make 5, he declared without irony. This obedience was compensated with increasingly ostentatious gestures of self-celebration and with erratic treatment toward his own team. On the ideological front, his anti-Semitism was pragmatic. It did not stem from personal conviction, but from aligning with the official party line. In cases like that of Erhard Milch, he subordinated even racial purity to convenience. He allowed Milch's rise in the air ministry by demanding a statement that formally dissociated him from his Jewish father. Göring summed up his criterion with a blunt phrase, "I decide who is a Jew." His stance toward the church was ambiguous. Although not devout, he promoted traditional ceremonies and sought to establish clear limits. Priests could speak, but only within the churches. As Prussian premier, he intervened directly in the ecclesiastical organization, imposing civil surveillance and assuming for himself the role of the highest religious authority of the state. In 1935, he married Emmy Sonnemann in a ceremony full of symbolism. After the reception, he took his guests to Karenhall, where he briefly withdrew to pray beside the coffin of his first wife. Meanwhile, his parties in Berlin and his role as an informal diplomat consolidated his image as the refined face of the regime before Europe. Consolidated as the visible face of the regime after the purge, Göring entered a period of unprecedented personal and political expansion. His wedding to Emmy was followed by an extensive tour of Eastern Europe, presented as a honeymoon but designed for diplomatic purposes. Between May and June 1935, he visited Budapest, Sofia, Dubrovnik, and Belgrade. In each capital, he was received by state leaders in a carefully orchestrated operation aimed at countering the alliances signed between France, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. Months later, when Hitler ordered the occupation of the Rhineland, Göring privately acknowledged the tension of the moment. But once it became clear that neither France nor the United Kingdom would respond with force, he took the propaganda initiative. He dissolved the Reichstag and traveled across Germany publicly defending the Führer's foreign policy as visionary and bold. In April 1936, Hitler assigned him control over foreign trade and raw materials. He accepted the position enthusiastically. It was a new path to expand his authority. That same year, during the party congress in Nuremberg, his appointment as commissioner of the 4-year plan was officially announced. From October onward, he had direct authority over ministries, agencies and organizations, with the power to issue decrees and intervene even at the highest levels of the state. From this position, he proclaimed that Germany would never again depend on foreign interests. He declared an economic crusade against speculators and hoarders, asserting that the entire economy must be subordinated to the needs of the state. He publicly rejected traditional economic laws and openly admitted his lack of experience in management or agriculture. "I have neither run companies nor cultivated anything other than a few pots on the balcony." That same summer, following a direct request from Franco, he supported alongside Hitler the deployment of men and material to the Spanish Civil War. Thus, the Condor Legion was born. In 1937, he reinforced his international profile with meetings with Mussolini, failed attempts to attend the coronation of George VI in London, and a visit to Poland where he promised, without real intention, to respect its borders. With economic control now in his hands, Göring also strengthened his role as the regime's informal ambassador. In the eyes of the British ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, he was the most accessible Nazi leader. Henderson described him as a rough character, but with a certain charm. He admired historical figures like Francis Drake and criticized the British for becoming, in his view, too civilized. For Henderson, his straightforward manner contrasted with the fanaticism of other leaders, although in the event of war, he did not doubt Göring's toughness. Despite his vanity in superficial matters, Göring often downplayed his own merit in essentials, repeatedly stating that everything came from Hitler. However, in diplomacy, he played a decisive role. In November 1937, he received Lord Halifax at Harrenhal. Dressed like a theatrical hunter, with a dagger at his belt and green leather attire, he insisted that Germany did not seek to resolve its tensions through violence. He claimed that the future of peace in Europe depended more on England than on the Reich. A few weeks later, he participated in the secret meeting on November 5th alongside Hitler, Blomberg, Neurath, and the High Military Command. There, the strategy for territorial expansion and the timeline to reach maximum military capacity before 1943 was outlined. Göring, as the architect of the four-year plan, was at the center of this machinery. That same year, he definitively broke with Hjalmar Schacht. In a lengthy letter, the banker criticized his policy of unsecured credits, his chaotic management of resources, and the damage to the internal economy. Göring reacted with disdain. Upon taking over the Ministry of Economics, he called Schacht and said, "I'm sitting in your chair." They would not see each other again until 8 years later, sharing the defendant's bench at Nuremberg. Despite the break with Schacht and the consolidation of his economic control, Göring regained a central role in internal power maneuvers. At the beginning of 1938, a crisis erupted within the military leadership. The wife of Field Marshal Blomberg was discovered to have a criminal record for prostitution and had posed in compromising photographs. It was the Berlin police chief who delivered this information to Keitel, who promptly turned to Göring. Göring ensured that the scandal reached Hitler directly, who swiftly dismissed Blomberg from his post and forced him into retirement. To prevent General Fritsch from succeeding as head of the army, Himmler and the Gestapo presented another dossier, this time accusing him of homosexuality. On January 26th, Hitler confronted Fritsch with the evidence in a meeting attended by Göring. Although Göring remained silent, he had hoped to be granted control over the armed forces. However, on February 4th, Hitler dissolved the cabinet for the final time and declared himself commander-in-chief. Göring did not receive the position, but retained significant influence. Nonetheless, Göring used the opportunity to appear moderate. He pressured the main witness in the case against Fritsch to admit that he had been intimidated by the Gestapo. This move, albeit belated, helped partially restore the general's reputation. A month later, Göring played a key role in another decisive operation, the annexation of Austria. From Berlin, he directed the action by phone. On the afternoon and evening of March 11th, he made more than 20 calls to Austrian officials, issuing orders in an imperious tone. He demanded the resignation of Chancellor Schuschnigg, the appointment of Seyss-Inquart as his successor, and the immediate formation of a cabinet loyal to the National Socialist Party. By the time the calls ended, Austria was already effectively German. Göring then took control of every step of the annexation process. From Berlin, he ordered that by 7:30 p.m., a fully National Socialist cabinet be installed and that the party with all its organizations, including the uniformed units, be legalized. When President Miklas hesitated, Göring threatened an immediate invasion. If he did not comply, Austria would cease to exist that very night. He demanded total control and warned that any resistance would be punished by military tribunals. To justify the deployment of troops, he ordered the drafting of a false telegram signed by Seyss-Inquart. Meanwhile, he reassured diplomats and lied to Czechoslovakia, assuring them there was no threat. After the success, he declared it the greatest trick ever played and celebrated having outwitted the foreign powers. Immediately after, Göring intensified his political presence on all fronts. He declared that Vienna must once again become a German city, a key point for the Reich's interests in the East. While assuring diplomats that Germany posed no threat to Czechoslovakia, he warned that any pressure against the Reich would be met with total resistance. Privately, he claimed that Hitler was emotionally invested in the situation because it was his homeland. While orchestrating diplomatic maneuvers, Göring aggressively promoted the expansion of anti-Semitism in both Austria and Germany. He insisted that commerce must be transferred into Aryan hands through a legal but unyielding process. He argued that the suicides of Jews could not be prevented and that he would not assign a policeman to guard each one. He rejected spontaneous manifestations, such as pogroms, because in his view they harmed the regime more than the victims. His strategy aimed at systematic exclusion. He proposed applying gradual pressures to compel Jews to leave the country on their own initiative. In a private remark, he stated that it would be enough to reserve a compartment for them on a train, and if there was no space, they would be expelled without the need for formal laws. He also imposed collective economic sanctions. He ordered that payments for damages caused during pogroms should not go to the victims, but to the Ministry of Finance. He even lamented that so much property had been destroyed instead of having killed more people. Before the end of 1938, he declared that Vienna must be free of Jewish population. In January 1939, he supported laws prohibiting Jews from operating businesses. He acknowledged that this would lead to the creation of ghettos in multiple cities, but considered it an inevitable consequence of the process. For him, everything had to be applied as an exemplary punishment. But Göring's own ambitions soon put his power at risk. The night of the November 1938 pogrom placed him in an awkward position. Publicly, he condemned the violence, yet privately he remarked that he would never again associate his name with acts of that nature. Some diplomats, such as Hans Hasso von Hassel, lamented that he did not seize the moment to break with Hitler. Though he claimed he would burn his honorary SS uniform and that even his wife had reprimanded him, he refused to punish those responsible with a telling phrase, "Do you want to punish the Führer?" Shortly thereafter, Göring signed the order establishing the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, placing it under the direction of Reinhard Heydrich. With this signature, he authorized the formal start of a strategy for the mass expulsion of Jews, cloaked in legality, which would soon evolve toward far more radical objectives. As head of the 4-year plan, Göring's working style increasingly revealed its imbalances. He had a sharp ability to grasp the essentials, but delegated details to his subordinates. He scribbled ideas in a notebook with an exaggeratedly large pencil, dictated orders without filters, and sent telegrams in the middle of meetings that were often incoherent. He preferred placing friends in key positions rather than qualified technicians. When warned that his collaborator Körner was incapable of understanding industrialists, he responded, "He is my friend, and I won't let anyone speak ill of him." Albert Speer, who knew him closely, described Göring as brilliant but scattered, with ideas that outpaced his ability to execute them. In 1938, he still showed energy, but his management was starting to display more flaws than results. Nevertheless, he acted independently by promoting contacts with London without consulting Ribbentrop, which sparked new tensions within the power circle. In October 1938, Göring attempted to reach out to France. He declared that with leaders like Daladier, negotiation was still possible and sought to open a direct channel with Ambassador Coulondre, offering to bypass Ribbentrop's filters. He also held talks with Polish Ambassador Lipski, where he noted concerns about Carpatho-Ukraine and the potential for a communist uprising in the region. In November, he met in Vienna with Ciano. Dressed in a flashy suit with ostentatious decorations, he struck his interlocutor as a caricature of a gangster. He verbally attacked the Hungarians and criticized King Boris of Bulgaria for seeking a union with Yugoslavia. At the same time, he was managing secret contacts with London, which caused friction within the Reich's diplomatic apparatus. By early 1939, his health began to deteriorate. He spent more time at Carinhall and Rominton, withdrawing from the front lines of decision-making. In February, he confessed to Henderson that he was exhausted and had lost weight. He expressed fear of a possible change in the British government that would bring Churchill to power. According to him, Churchill would prefer spending on architecture and social welfare rather than rearmament. However, when Hitler decided to invade the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March, Göring was directly involved in pressuring President Hoxha. He threatened to bomb Prague and urgently called Hitler's doctor when the elderly president collapsed. Later, Göring admitted that everything had been done behind his back and that he never actually set foot in Prague. Shortly afterward, he suffered a personal humiliation. He saw Ribbentrop receive an Italian decoration that Göring felt he himself deserved. By May, already diminished in influence, he was summoned by Hitler to a secret meeting with the High Command to be briefed on the war plans. There were no questions asked, only orders given. That summer of 1939, Göring sought to regain political prominence through an informal channel, Birger Dahlérus, a Swedish businessman with strong connections in the United Kingdom. Despite his frequent commitments at Carinhall, Göring devoted over an hour listening to Dahlérus's impressions regarding the tensions with London. He confided that, in his view, the British were merely feigning firmness to hinder German development, and that he himself did not desire a war. Shortly afterward, Göring organized a secret meeting at Sönke-Nissen-Kug, where he solemnly assured that Germany had no plans to encircle Poland, and that resolving the Danzig issue would not lead to further territorial demands. For Göring, this mediation was an opportunity to weaken Ribbentrop's position and to reassert his influence over Hitler as a champion of negotiation. Though his real authority had waned, Göring still tried to play the role of peacemaker. He confided in Dahlérus that his policy of understanding with Warsaw had failed, and that the real problem was not Danzig, but Poland's alliance with London. When Hitler praised the Luftwaffe, Göring submissively laughed nervously and roughly marked on a map the regions Germany intended to occupy. In private, Dahlérus felt disappointed by Göring's deferential attitude toward Hitler. Still, Göring continued to nurture hope. On August 29th, he shook Dahlérus's hand enthusiastically and declared that peace was assured. But after the German ultimatum, he blamed the British and fiercely defended the Reich's position. Quietly, he admitted fearing for Dahlérus's safety and openly named Ribbentrop as the true danger. On August 31st, in desperation, Göring agreed to make one last call to the British embassy. Even then, he rushed through the conversation, nervous as if he knew nothing could stop the storm that was about to break. The Air Strategist, War, Failures and Key Decisions. Fourth World War II, 1939 to 1945. When the conflict with Poland reached its breaking point, Göring was still trying to avoid a full-scale war. Privately, he claimed to be the only one among the top commanders who did not want it. According to his sister Olga, he even embraced her in tears and lamented that everyone wanted to fight except him. Through hassle, he tried to influence Henderson to force a dialogue, although he insisted that Warsaw must send negotiators immediately. On August 31st, he was still meeting with Dahlérus while organizing the transfer of his art collections, in case Berlin was bombed. When he was handed an intercepted telegram between the Polish embassy and Warsaw, he read it with fury, convinced that there was no longer any intention to negotiate. He copied the text in his own handwriting and sent it to the British as proof. Still with Henderson, he tried to show a human side. He said he would hate to bomb England, but if the ambassador died, he promised to drop a wreath from the sky. The scene turned grotesque when he arranged one last meeting between Dahlérus and Hitler, who acted wildly in front of them. Even Göring, embarrassed, looked away. On September 1st, no longer wielding real influence, he admitted that the Luftwaffe was in full offensive over Poland. He justified himself by blaming both the British and the Poles. Just 2 days later, he received London's ultimatum with surprise. He was unable to react and simply placed all the responsibility on Chamberlain. Already named Hitler's official successor, his power seemed intact. But that very day, the Führer completely ignored him. Göring, disoriented, murmured to Schmidt a phrase that summed it all up. "If we lose this war, may God have mercy on us." When the war broke out, Göring focused his efforts on demonstrating German air superiority. The invasion of Poland became the first real test of the model he had promoted: massive aerial assault followed by rapid ground advance. While the motorized divisions crossed the country, Luftwaffe bombers, led by Richthofen, destroyed airfields, troops, and cities. Warsaw was devastated using the same technique previously applied in Guernica, and images of the disaster were used to produce a propaganda film titled The Baptism of Fire. This initial success strengthened Göring's and Hitler's belief that modern warfare would be won from the skies. The speed of the campaign confirmed their bet on short-range bombers and lightning attacks. However, even before the conflict, the development of heavy bombers had been discarded, which later left Germany at a clear disadvantage against the Allied powers. The Luftwaffe not only lacked strategic autonomy, but also remained subordinated to the army. Its structure had been shaped by officers without a unified vision between air and land forces. Furthermore, Göring's decisions were driven not by real military needs, but by his own pride. As soon as the first difficulties arose, the commanders he himself had promoted clashed with his orders. During the first months, he insisted that his air force could solve everything. He refused to support the navy in attacks on British convoys and limited bombing in the West, following Hitler's orders. His favorite phrase, repeated in factories and on the radio, was, "Leave it in the hands of my Luftwaffe." By September, he was threatening reprisals if France or the United Kingdom dared to respond. By then, he believed the war was already won, the Allied powers. Göring continued to support the Blitzkrieg strategy, with the Luftwaffe playing the absolute leading role. In the Norway campaign, his air force played a key role in the advance, although Scandinavian resistance, supported by British and French forces, held out for weeks. Despite naval losses, air attacks allowed the Germans to consolidate control over the region. In May 1940, the offensive in the West began. Under the name Operation Yellow, German troops crossed into the Netherlands and Belgium. Within weeks, Germany controlled much of the continent. The fall of Rotterdam included massive bombings by the Stukas, just as the city's surrender was already being negotiated. Göring made sure to present these events as proof of his air force's invincibility. He confidently claimed the war would end soon. But his personal involvement at Dunkirk marked the start of a strategic mistake. He convinced Hitler to halt the armoured divisions and to rely solely on air attacks to annihilate the retreating Allies. The reason, more than tactical, was pride. Göring wanted his air force to win the battle without ground support. However, the outcome was a failure. Weather conditions limited air operations, and the Royal Air Force put up unexpected resistance. During the nighttime evacuation, German fighters didn't even fly. In his diary, General Halder directly blamed the decisions imposed from above. Despite everything, Göring sought to turn the setback into a symbolic victory. He visited Dunkirk after the Allied withdrawal and organized a tour among the abandoned wreckage, presenting it as a war trophy. For him, the solution remained the same: bomb first, always from the air. After the Dunkirk retreat, Göring again promised victory from the skies. On July 11th, he ordered the destruction of both the British armaments industry and the RAF before the invasion began. According to his calculations, the defences in the south would fall in 4 days, and the enemy air force would not hold out for more than a month. At the beginning of August, the aerial offensive was launched with attacks on ports and airfields. On the 15th of that month, more than 1,000 bomber and fighter sorties were carried out. The Battle of Britain had begun, but the weather and British resistance frustrated expectations. On September 7th, after a small attack on Berlin, Hitler authorized reprisals against London. Göring watched the start of the Blitz from a hill at Cap Blanc-Nez and spoke to the nation about striking directly at the enemy's heart. More than 600 bombers and an equal number of fighters crossed the Channel in a single day. And even under pressure, the RAF held firm. The Spitfire fighters proved superior to both the Stukas and the Messerschmitts. bomber losses mounted, and Göring, dissatisfied, ordered a switch to nighttime bombings. It was an unspoken admission of failure. On September 17th, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. For Göring, it was a bitter blow. The cancellation of the invasion confirmed that his Luftwaffe had not met its objective. Still, he pushed for converting some fighters into light bombers, which caused discontent among his own pilots. His response was to blame them for not adequately protecting the formations. In October, however, he publicly praised his air force. He claimed that their relentless attacks on London had sown fear among British leaders. In reality, the German air offensive had reached its limit. The aerial failure over the United Kingdom caused Göring to focus his attention on other fronts. On July 31, 1941, he signed an order addressed to Heydrich that marked a point of no return. He was to coordinate the so-called final solution in all territories under Reich control. He demanded a general plan with the administrative and logistical measures necessary to carry it out. From that moment on, the mass extermination of Jews became a central policy of the regime, formally backed from the highest levels. There is no doubt that Göring was aware of the massacres. On August 6, 1942, he presided over a meeting where the Reich commissioner in the East openly spoke of tens of thousands of murders in Belarus. Göring neither objected nor showed surprise. That same year, he oversaw measures to maximize economic exploitation of the occupied territories. In November, he ordered the ruthless use of Soviet prisoners and civilians as forced labor. By then, Germany controlled millions of captives. Nearly 2 million were already working in war production factories. His view of the conflict included a brutally Darwinian dimension. In a private statement, he said that tens of millions would die of starvation in Russia, and that such an outcome did not worry him. If anyone was to survive, he said, it would be the Germans and their allies first. Moreover, he formalized the forced use of foreign workers. At the beginning of 1942, he authorized Sokol to organize the systematic deportation of labor. He abolished his own personnel offices and gave Sokol direct authority to recruit by any means necessary. During a conference, he was explicit. The suffering of the occupied populations did not matter. His sole objective, he said bluntly, was to extract every useful resource for the German people, like a bloodhound on the trail. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, everything was beginning to collapse. The debacle at Stalingrad marked the most critical point in Göring's loss of power. When the Sixth Army was encircled by the Red Army, he tried to regain Hitler's favor with a reckless promise: to supply the besieged troops from the air. He assured that the Luftwaffe would deliver hundreds of tons of supplies daily, despite the extreme conditions of the Russian winter and the precariousness of his resources. The operation was a complete failure, and General Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943. The defeat was catastrophic, with immediate internal consequences. Shortly after, Hitler unleashed his fury. According to Goebbels, he confronted Göring without restraint, and the criticism was so severe that even Bodenschatz, one of his trusted men, received the message. By then, Göring was in Rome, absent at a critical moment. His closeness to the Führer, which had been solid until 1941, began to rapidly erode. Adding to his loss of power was an increasingly grotesque personal image. At his residence, he appeared in oriental robes, ostentatious jewelry, and a golden dagger as part of his daily attire. Far from the figure of a commander, he had become an eccentric and decadent character. At Nuremberg, he himself would acknowledge that his influence faded between 1942 and 1943. Although he still held titles and nominal command, his effective authority diminished day by day. Even within the regime, criticism piled up. Goebbels described him as exhausted and unreliable. Milch, from the Luftwaffe, viewed with frustration his inability to organize a functional air structure. The constant promise of results that never came ended up defining his role. He had replaced reality with false figures, and his habit of interfering in everything without judgment only worsened the collapse. The air divisions that emerged during that period were not the result of strategy, but of the disorder he himself encouraged. As the war became increasingly unfavorable for Germany, Göring sought comfort and legitimacy in a different dimension of the conflict: art. His need for ostentation had deep roots. Since youth, he had associated prestige with the visible symbols of power. At Carinhall, his personal residence, he proudly displayed the decorations, jewels, and acquired pieces, not only as valuable objects, but as testimony of his personal rise. When he received the widow of his former protector, he pointed to the luxury around him with a revealing phrase, "Pity the old man couldn't see this." His collector's obsession was not a superficial hobby. In art, he found a form of escape, but also a symbol of permanence. What he could not achieve with the Luftwaffe, he intended to accomplish with his private gallery. According to his own declaration in Nuremberg, his goal was to found a national art museum in his name, located on the grounds of Carinhall. As late as January 1945, architectural plans for that ambitious project were still preserved. To assemble the collection, he appointed Walter Andreas Hofer as his agent, an experienced art dealer from Berlin. His taste was conservative. He admired Rubens and the Dutch masters, and rejected all forms of modern expression, from Gauguin to Picasso. He shared with Hitler a deep contempt for the avant-garde. The collection grew in step with the territorial expansion of the Reich. On November 5, 1940, he signed an order classifying the looted artworks into 4 groups, reserving for himself those that would complete his personal collection. By July 1944, the inventory listed more than 21,000 items: paintings, tapestries, furniture, and decorative objects. Göring even claimed to possess the largest private collection in Europe and publicly thanked Alfred Rosenberg for facilitating its growth. For him, this visual legacy was more enduring than any military victory. Much of that looting was managed from Paris by the unit in charge of seizing cultural assets. Göring publicly defended it when rumors of illegal trafficking began to circulate, and he praised its members' performance without reservation. In a letter to Rosenberg dated May 1942, he stated that few departments of the regime deserved as much recognition for their consistency and efficiency. The acquisitions were not limited to art. There were also financial transfers. In December 1940, an internal report recorded that the Marshal had received over 1 million florins for personal purchases, advanced by the military command in the Netherlands. Part of that sum was reimbursed through a special account of the Prussian state. This covert financing sustained an operation that blended aesthetic ambition with political opportunism. In a second letter from Rosenberg dated June 1942, it was suggested that the artworks confiscated from Jews be turned over to the party as official property. Göring enthusiastically supported the proposal, convinced that such valuable pieces should reinforce the symbolic power of the regime. The scale of the confiscation speaks for itself. When Allied troops intercepted one of the trains transporting the loot to Germany, they encountered an overwhelming scene: paintings spread across 40 rooms, sculptures crammed into hallways, tapestries stacked to the ceiling, and boxes filled with porcelain and empty frames. By that point, Göring was no longer seeking just material power, but a form of eternity built from canvas, marble, and gold. That, in his view, would be the final stronghold of his legacy. Fall from the top, collapse, arrest, and breakdown. As the Soviet encirclement tightened around Germany, Göring stayed close to Hitler, although his influence was increasingly diminished. In one of their final conversations, he expressed outrage at the possibility of being pushed out of power. "Only a complete bastard would accept such a demotion," he remarked. In another talk, he questioned whether Germany's sacrifice was merely to hand over Eastern Europe to Stalin. "They went to war to stop us in the south, not to let the East reach the Atlantic." Shortly after, he suffered one of the hardest personal blows: the evacuation of Carinhall. His luxurious retreat, a symbol of his power and ambition, was emptied and later demolished on his own orders. As he departed, he instructed engineers to blow up the site, reducing it to rubble. At the same time, in Berlin, key figures of the regime openly despised him. Goebbels accused him of being indifferent to the suffering of the people and criticized his apparent comfort while the cities were being devastated. Martin Bormann, for his part, saw him as an obstacle to be eliminated and suspected that Göring was merely waiting for the right moment to seize power. Even in the final days inside the bunker, his demeanor seemed disconnected. One witness described him as sunk into his leather briefcase, his gaze lost. In a meeting with General Galland, he expressed a melancholic wish. "I wish I were younger and thinner. I'd place myself under your command just to fight again like in the old days." On April 23 from Berchtesgaden, Göring sent a telegram to Hitler citing the 1941 decree that named him as successor. He asked whether he should assume control of the Reich, warning that if he received no reply before 10 p.m., he would act on his own. Hitler interpreted this as an attempted coup. He responded by revoking the decree and ordered that Göring be barred from taking any further action. Bormann went further. He organized Göring's formal dismissal, accused him of treason, and ordered his arrest. SS officers were sent to Obersalzberg to detain him along with his closest associates. The man who once aspired to inherit Hitler's empire ended up confined, stripped of power and isolated on the brink of the Third Reich's final collapse. In the last days of the Reich, Hermann Göring witnessed his political and personal downfall. After receiving Hitler's rejection of his April 23 telegram, where he invoked his right to assume leadership under the 1941 decree, Göring's chalet in Obersalzberg was surrounded by the SS before 7 p.m. Shortly after, armed officers entered the premises and arrested him without violence. He was forbidden from seeing his wife and daughter, isolated in a room, and his home was turned into an improvised prison. His chief of staff, Koller, was arrested shortly thereafter, without any clear explanation of the charges. Hitler interpreted the telegram as an act of treason. "An ultimatum," he shouted to Grime. On April 26, Obersalzberg was bombed. Göring, his family and his escorts barely managed to take refuge in a bunker with no sanitary conditions. 4 days later, Hitler signed his political testament. He expelled Göring from the party, annulled the succession decree, and accused him, along with Himmler, of negotiating with the enemy behind the leadership's back. Dönitz was appointed president of the Reich. From the bunker, Bormann ordered Göring's arrest for high treason. In a message dated May 1st, he called for the elimination of the traitors of April 23rd if Berlin were to fall. But Göring, confined in Mautendorf, managed to attract a Luftwaffe unit. When they passed nearby, he stepped out and ordered them to rescue him. There was no resistance. "It was one of the most beautiful moments of my life," he would later say, recalling how they saluted him with full honors. On May 6th, now free, Göring sent a letter to Dönitz denouncing Bormann's intrigues and requesting to take part in the negotiations with Eisenhower from marshal to marshal. He was arrested the next day near Rastatt by American troops. In Fischhorn, he appeared relaxed, sharing stories with the soldiers. Days later in Kitzbühel, he was photographed laughing with American officers, drink in hand, in front of the Texan flag to which he had surrendered his command. In Augsburg, on May 11th, he declared that his initiative to assume control had been misunderstood by Hitler. According to him, he had only acted in accordance with what was stipulated. The hero of the Luftwaffe was finally becoming a prisoner of the Nazi twilight. The final trial, Göring, before the court of history. After his capture, Göring was transferred on May 21st to the former Palace Hotel in Mondorf, renamed by the Americans as Ashcan. Housed within walls stripped of all luxury, he was subjected to a strict medical routine. His addiction to paracodeine, which had accompanied him for years, was incompatible with the new conditions. He arrived at the place overweight and carrying 2 suitcases full of pills. According to the doctors, his daily consumption was 20 times the normal dose. Under supervision, his treatment consisted of gradually reducing the number of tablets until his dependence was completely eliminated. In parallel, his dietary and physical regimen allowed him to lose more than 25 kilos before being sent to Nuremberg in September. At Ashcan, his former assistant Robert Kropp tried to continue caring for him. Göring, aware of his new status as a common prisoner, confessed to him that he had kept a poison capsule, a direct inheritance from Hitler's command. Shortly after, Kropp was separated from him, and Göring was placed under the care of a German prisoner assigned as his assistant. Despite the surroundings, the former marshal showed a surprisingly cooperative attitude. He received figures such as Yvonne Kirkpatrick, with whom he debated strategic issues, lamenting that Hitler had not followed his proposal to take Gibraltar through Spain. He also maintained that the air defeat in the United Kingdom marked the true turning point. Dr. Douglas Kelly, a military psychiatrist, observed in him an extreme physical narcissism. Göring took care of his skin with lotions, wore silk underwear, and wore rings with precious stones that he matched depending on the day. His personal items, made of gold and set with stones, revealed an obsession with image even in captivity. Despite everything, his main concern was not the sentence, but his legacy. He claimed he was not guilty of crimes, but a defender of the Reich. "Yes, I know they will hang me," he once said, "but in the future there will be statues of me all over Germany." During his testimony in Nuremberg, Hermann Göring did not deny his responsibility within the regime. On the contrary, he emphatically claimed it. He stated that he had devoted all his efforts to consolidating the power of the National Socialist Party and securing Hitler's leadership as head of state. In his own words, he had worked tirelessly to bring the Führer to the position he deserved. Regarding the 1934 purge, known as the Night of the Long Knives, Göring acknowledged his role in the executions and asserted that he had acted out of duty, convinced that the situation was already out of control. Years later, he still believed he had done the right thing. He also took responsibility for the anti-Semitic laws that bore his signature, particularly the Nuremberg laws. He maintained that the orders came from Hitler, but that he himself had drafted and enacted them, and he did not intend to hide behind the Führer's figure. Furthermore, he defended the principle of vertical authority as the only possible model in Germany, reaffirming his loyalty to the Führerprinzip. Regarding the abuses committed by the Gestapo, he acknowledged that they occurred while he still had direct contact with the secret police. He assured that sanctions were applied at the time, but also admitted that only the cases that became public were punished. Göring justified the elimination of opposition parties with a blunt phrase, "We had had enough of opposition." He insisted that the power structure needed to be concentrated in order to rebuild the country. And although he disagreed with Hitler on some strategic decisions, such as the invasion of the USSR, he affirmed that he never thought of abandoning him. He had given his word, and that was, for him, irrevocable. Even in his downfall, Göring presented himself as the second man of the Reich, convinced that history would one day judge him benevolently. In the final days of the trial, he tried to shape his image as that of a misunderstood patriot. He claimed to have sought a peaceful solution to the conflict with Poland, assuring that his intention was not to isolate Warsaw or deceive London, but to reach an agreement similar to Munich. However, the testimony of Birger Dahlerus directly contradicted him. Dahlerus stated that, had he known what was later revealed, he would never have believed it possible to avoid the war. During the interrogations, Göring maintained a defiant attitude. Prosecutor Jackson publicly pointed out his arrogance, reminding him that he was receiving a trial he had never granted to his victims. Regarding the events of the 1938 pogrom, he tried to downplay them, justifying his statements as an impulsive reaction to the material damage caused. When questioned about the massacre of the airmen who escaped from the Stalag Luft 3 camp, he denied having any involvement or knowledge. He also declared that he had not been aware of the systematic extermination of the Jews, claiming that even Hitler was unaware of its magnitude. Faced with the accusation of slavery, he acknowledged the existence of forced labor but rejected that it constituted slavery. In his final statement, he insisted that he did not want the war, that he fought for victory only out of love for his people. He concluded by reaffirming his loyalty to the Führer, even in bad times when it is much harder to keep a vow. After hearing his sentence in Nuremberg, Hermann Göring was no longer the proud Nazi leader who had dominated the political and military stage of the Third Reich. Convicted of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity, the tribunal defined him as the main instigator of the war after Hitler. He was found guilty of directing forced labor programs, repressing minorities, and using the power of the state to consolidate a dictatorship based on terror. His guilt, the sentence said, is unique in its enormity. There are no excuses for this man. When the verdict was read, Göring remained motionless. Upon hearing the phrase, "death by hanging," he dropped the headphones without saying a word and left the courtroom. Back in his cell, he uttered a single word: death. Then, his hands began to tremble. He took a book to calm himself and asked to be left alone. In the following days, he wrote a final letter to his wife, Emmy. He thanked her for the love she had given him, asked her to take care of their daughter, and closed with a heartfelt farewell. He also requested to be executed by firing squad instead of hanging, appealing to his status as a military officer. The request was denied. On the night of October 15, 1946, Göring committed suicide in his cell using a poison capsule he had managed to hide. He was found just before 11 o'clock at night, convulsing. His body was cremated alongside those of other convicted leaders, and the ashes were scattered. There was no ceremony, only the closing of a judicial process that, for the first time in 20th century history, held state leaders criminally responsible for international crimes.